Hello, friends! Today on our channel, we have a fascinating story that is especially interesting because it is already fully concluded. Usually, I show different scams in car deals, explain how everything works, and give advice on how to avoid getting into such situations when buying or selling a car. As you know, investigations and court proceedings can drag on, but in this story, we already know how everything ended, who got what, and who faced what kind of punishment. I want to say right away, the information you're about to hear should not be taken as a guide to action. This is a real story, but it is definitely not an example to follow. The lessons to be learned from this case are how not to become a victim of scammers. This could have happened to anyone who decided to buy a car. The story began when a couple from London with a Subaru decided to drive to the wife's parents in Paris. They arrived without any problems, but unfortunately, their engine broke down in Paris. Upon contacting a service center, they found out that the repair would cost a substantial amount, so they decided not to spend time and money on repairs and simply sell the car. Initially, they planned to sell it later, but they decided to act sooner because the breakdown ruined all their plans. So, they started looking for a buyer and a new car as they planned to return home to London in a new vehicle. They chose a hybrid Honda Insight. They contacted the seller, met, and went to the traffic police, GIBBD, to check the car. They checked all the documents and numbers. Everything was fine. But doubts arose when the seller said that the numbers were important to him as they were special to him. He said he was going to the GIBBD to change them, since it was his turn. The seller went to the window, and indeed, they changed the numbers. The car passed all the checks, and the seller handed over the vehicle registration certificate, PTS, to the buyer. At first glance, everything seemed fine, but there was one thing the buyer didn't notice. The seller had become the car owner that day. The car was registered, the PTS was changed, and it was handed over to the buyer. The PTS looked normal, and everything seemed in order. Then, the buyer and seller went to the GIBBD to register the car under the new owner. All actions were standard, the seller was nearby, checking the documents, and everything seemed safe. After the numbers were transferred to the new owner, the buyer paid the seller. For many, this moment is a guarantee that the deal went smoothly. All documents are in place, and the car is registered. But, as I said, things are not always so smooth. At first glance, everything was done by the rules. But, as you've already guessed, it wasn't that simple. Let's continue. Everything seemed fine. The seller did the document checks, they exchanged numbers, signed the contract, shook hands, and continued on their way. The car had no encumbrances. Everything was clean. Both the seller and the buyer were fully confident that everything was fine. So they set off for home, and it seemed all the risks were gone. But then came the moment when the buyer decided that everything wasn't as good as it seemed. Time passed, and he received a lawsuit. Yes, a lawsuit. And that's when he began to realize that things weren't so clean. At first, it could have been simply told in a few words, but why not read the text and understand what really happened? Here's how it went. In August 2015, the buyer purchased the Honda Insight under a sales agreement. Soon, at the end of that same year, he found out that his acquaintance, Thomas, had sold the car without his knowledge or consent, and not just sold it, but had carried out a whole chain of criminal actions. As a result, the buyer filed a report with the police, and a criminal case was opened under Article 160, Part 3 of the Criminal Code. Now here's where it gets interesting. The court referred to the decision of another court regarding the criminal case, and based on that, a civil lawsuit was built. The details will come later, but the fact remains that the car was sold without the owner's knowledge. Now let's break down how all this happened. It turned out that Thomas forged the sales contract, listing himself as the buyer and another person, Mark, as the seller. Then, with this forged contract, Thomas sold the car under the same contract, pretending to be the owner of the car. It looked like a legitimate deal, but it was, of course, illegal. Here's how it looked in detail. In late October 2015, Thomas asked his acquaintance, James, for a car for personal use. James, trusting Thomas, handed over the car, but after some time, on November 2, 2015, Thomas decided to use the car for his own purposes and sold it, causing James a financial loss of $450,000. This turned out to be a real scam. Now, let's go back to the lawsuit. James claims that he bought the car from Mark under a sales contract but never registered the car in his name. The car stayed with him for some time until Thomas, citing personal friendship, asked him to lend the car for use. And here is where the real scheme begins. James not only trusted Thomas with the car, but also with the vehicle registration certificate, PTS, and the sales contract he had signed with Mark. And that's where it all started. Why would someone in their right mind give their vehicle registration certificate to an acquaintance? The answer to this question lies within the scheme itself. If this hadn't been part of a crime, it never would have happened. So, the car was handed over to Thomas, who forged the contract, and then the chain of sales began, continuing with each new owner. This is evident in the case materials. The car was resold several times, and each time the situation became more complicated and convoluted. Thomas continued his chain of manipulations. He forged the contract, removing the name of the original seller and writing himself as the seller, with James as the buyer. Presenting himself as the owner, Thomas sold the car again and thus began his resale scheme. Let's break down how this happened. James sold the car to his acquaintance Robert in August 2015. Then Robert passed the car to Daniel, and Daniel sold it to Edward. Edward in turn became the person who received the new PTS and kept the registration plates at the registration service. Edward eventually sold the car to Chris, who became the final buyer. In this chain of sales, the car was registered twice, and the second time was on the day of the transaction when Edward registered the car and changed the PTS to a duplicate. This was done deliberately so that the PTS wouldn't show multiple owners, and simply because the original document didn't have enough space. This raises questions when a car is resold every 2 or 3 days. Edward received a new PTS, becoming the sole owner of the car, even though he only owned it for 1 day. This was all part of a well-planned scheme that involved many people. If it hadn't been for this scheme, no one would have manipulated the documents and registration so skillfully. Now, let's return to the lawsuit. In the lawsuit filed by Chris, it is mentioned that he refers to the court verdict in the criminal case. In this case, it is unnecessary to prove the facts already established. Chris refers to the verdict against Thomas, claiming that his actions were qualified under Article 160, Part 3 of the Criminal Code. He requests that the sales contract forged by Thomas be declared invalid and that the car be removed from illegal use. But in addition to that, Chris will have to pay a state fee, $7,700. Naturally, no one is going to return the money. If there had been any slightest chance of a refund, no one would have engaged in these schemes. Instead, Chris needs to pay a fee of $7,700. And here comes the interesting point. How was everything organized? Thomas and Robert were friends, but after Thomas deceitfully took the car and sold it, their friendship clearly deteriorated. The lawsuit didn't mention that Thomas forged the contract, but the criminal case materials made it clear how it all happened. Later in the court ruling published on the website, it is clearly stated how Thomas, knowing that his friend had a car, asked him to lend the car for temporary use. Robert trusted him with his Honda Insight, worth $450,000. Thomas used the car and after a few days decided to buy it, agreeing on a price of $400,000 and an additional rental fee of $50,000. They ended up making a verbal agreement and the scheme continued. Thomas's punishment was significantly softened, and it was done quite skillfully. The court didn't add extra charges like fraud and tried to avoid aggravating circumstances. As a result, the court found that Thomas, according to his statement, indeed intended to return the car and had no intention to steal or deceive. He even claimed that their agreement was merely preliminary, and he always intended to sell the car back to his acquaintance. But all of this was, of course, part of his defense. The court, in turn, acknowledged that although Thomas did not have a clear intent to commit fraud, he forged the sales contract, which led to the appropriation of someone else's property. As a result, he caused material damage in the amount of $400,000 and even stated that he acted for personal gain. Now, let's turn to the civil lawsuit filed by the final buyer. He claimed that he purchased the car on January 8, 2016 from Robert. The PTS was registered in Robert's name, and the car passed inspection at the traffic police, GIBBD. All numbers, VIN codes, and potential fines were checked, and the registration was completed by a GIBBD officer. The buyer claimed that he exercised the necessary caution and diligence when concluding the deal. He considered himself not only a good faith buyer, but also the legitimate owner of the car because all checks were carried out and there were no doubts about the transaction. However, despite all these arguments, the court declared the sales contract that was forged by Thomas invalid. As a result, a verdict was issued which required the car to be seized from the final buyer and for him to pay a state fee of $7,700. But let's not forget, we also have Thomas with his criminal case. In another district of the same city, the court made a ruling on his case, and now let's see what punishment he received for his actions. It's worth noting that Thomas filed the petition for a special court procedure and fully agreed with the charges presented. The court accepted his statement, and here's what we know. The court found him guilty of committing the crime and sentenced him to 2 years in prison, but the sentence was suspended, with no fines or other restrictions. Thomas was not presented with any additional serious charges, and despite all his manipulations, the punishment was minimal. The court did not establish any aggravating circumstances in the case. However, despite this, Thomas fully admitted his guilt, expressed remorse, and, as it turned out, had never been previously criminally prosecuted. Additionally, the victim did not insist on a severe punishment for the defendant. The court found him guilty of committing the crime and sentenced him to 2 years in prison, but the sentence was suspended. In other words, the person received a 2-year suspended sentence with no fines or other restrictions. Furthermore, the case included procedural costs, which totaled $4,290. This money was paid from the federal budget since Thomas received assistance from a public defender, whose services were paid by the state. Interesting point. Thomas actually didn't spend a penny on a lawyer and didn't incur any financial losses while receiving a suspended sentence. The entire process surprisingly cost him very little. This story could have ended here, but as you understand, events continued. When Christopher, the buyer of the car, realized that his car was being taken by the court's decision, the situation took an unexpected turn. Suddenly, his Honda was in a serious accident. It was hit by a truck. The truck driver was found at fault, and Christopher received a substantial payout from the insurance company considering the value of the car. After receiving the payout, he decided to minimize his losses by selling several parts of the car, including the battery. Thus, he covered most of the damage. The car was repaired several times after the accident and was ready for sale. But, as you can imagine, it could have been seized at any time by court order. Christopher decided to simply leave the car somewhere under a fence and continue with his life. Time passed, and indeed, people appeared with an enforcement officer's order. The car was seized, despite all of Christopher's efforts. And here begins the real surrealism. The car was taken, and Christopher and his acquaintances managed to go on vacation to Turkey, completely not expecting such a turn of events. At this point, resellers appeared, who were essentially already preparing the documents for the car's further seizure. They presented the enforcement officer's certificate and took the car. Christopher, in astonishment, realized that he not only lost the car, but also a large sum of money, and all that remained to him were the car keys, which, by the way, turned out to be duplicates, not the original ones, which raised even more questions when he realized that the handover of keys and documents had been done incorrectly and he couldn't control the situation, even though he was the owner of the car. After the car was taken, Christopher realized that the situation had spiraled out of control. He thought everything was fine, but when he was told that the car was gone for good, He began to wonder why he hadn't demanded money from the person he bought the car from. After all, he genuinely bought the car from the actual owner, the very same Robert who signed the contract and handled the PTS in his presence. He could have negotiated with this person and gone to court to get his money back. But, as it turned out, it was not that simple. When Christopher checked Robert, he discovered that Robert was deeply in debt and dealing with bailiffs. At that point, the amount Christopher had lost was $100,000. But as it turned out, things were not that simple. As Christopher himself said, "I just gave up on it because he saw no point in chasing after the money." All attempts to recover even a small amount through the court were futile, and no one was willing to take the risk, especially since all these proceedings were happening in a different region, requiring additional efforts. Christopher simply shrugged it off and forgot about it, though the situation could have gone differently. But as it turned out, this was just the beginning. Then came the accident. The Honda was hit by a truck, and the truck driver was found at fault. Christopher received insurance, which covered a large part of the losses. He decided to minimize the damage by selling some parts of the car, including the battery. But despite this, he left the car behind, knowing that it would soon be seized by court order. Time passed, and indeed, the bailiffs arrived with a decree. The car was taken, and Christopher was already on vacation when the situation unfolded. The car was seized, and after some time, resellers appeared, who obtained documents confirming their right to seize the car. Christopher couldn't believe how quickly everything happened, and that his car was now in someone else's hands. The car was gone, and he was in shock, but later realized that all of this was pointless. Everything happened as if his car had simply been handed over to someone without any control. At this point, the story could have ended, but we should once again highlight the important lesson to be learned from what happened. It is crucial to be extremely cautious when buying a car. Before signing documents and finalizing a deal, make sure everything is clean. This is especially important when dealing with duplicate PTS or vehicle registration certificates, which should always raise suspicion. Ideally, the longer the period, the better. If the PTS was issued less than 6 months ago, it's better to avoid such a purchase. Also, avoid deals where a car is sold with a duplicate PTS. This is always a red flag because fraudulent schemes are often linked to quick sales and registrations. All of this requires a certain level of caution to avoid falling into a trap. Try to avoid buying cars through agreements where, for example, someone is selling a car but has not registered it in their name with the registration service. Why deal with such schemes? Why create unnecessary headaches for yourself? Your task is to simplify the car buying process as much as possible. Buy the car from the actual owner who has registered it, driven it for some time, and then decided to sell it. When I check cars for my clients or select a car to order, I always recommend buying only from the owner. We never offer buyers cars that are sold through an agreement without being registered in the owner's name. This is excluded. It's also not a bad idea to check the owner a bit more thoroughly beyond just asking for their regular passport. For example, you can ask for a foreign passport if you have doubts. Of course, you might get a refusal, but it's always worth asking for an additional document. If you don't want to bother with a foreign passport, you can ask the owner to show mobile apps like government services, banking apps, or even a medical card. All of this proves that the person hasn't forged their passport. The length of time the person has owned the car also plays a significant role. In my opinion, a minimum of 3 months, but better yet 6. If someone recently bought the car, registered it, and then immediately resells it, that's already suspicious. Unfortunately, a short ownership period isn't always a good indicator. It's possible that the car is already in enforcement proceedings or has restrictions on it, and the person just manages to sell it before those restrictions take effect. The longer the ownership period, the better. If a person doesn't register the car in their name but sells it through an agreement, this is actually very risky. There may be various motivations such as not wanting to pay taxes or not taking up space in the PTS, but this should not be the norm. It's better to avoid such situations. Now let's talk about duplicate PTS. In our case, the buyer confused two terms, claiming that the PTS was the original. In fact, the original is not a forgery, but it's not the primary document for the car. It's a duplicate. Unfortunately, not all duplicates have a clear stamp that says duplicate. In the past, such stamps were almost always placed, but now they are practically never applied. And the only way to tell whether the PTS is a duplicate or the original is by looking at documents issued by customs or the manufacturer. If the PTS mentions that it was issued by an organization involved in modifying vehicles, such as converting tanks into refrigerators or armoring vehicles, that's also likely a duplicate. Such organizations can issue PTS, and if the organization's name contains abbreviations associated with registration bodies or government inspection, this almost always indicates that the PTS was issued secondarily, meaning it's a duplicate. Unfortunately, duplicates don't always have a clear duplicate stamp, although they used to. Now, to distinguish the original from the duplicate, you need to carefully look for special markings in the PTS that indicate information about the previous PTS and its status, such as issued as a replacement for the lost one. This is important. You should always carefully check documents and try to distinguish a duplicate from the original even if there are no obvious stamps. This will help avoid possible problems. I also recommend being cautious when buying a car. For example, if the PTS was issued not too long ago, that should raise a red flag. The older the PTS, the better. This reduces the risks that the car might have problems.